My husband wanted a divorce to marry his 19-year-old secretary, and his entire family applauded the decision. It was a cold, calculated betrayal that left no room for sentimentality, as if they were discussing the liquidation of a minor asset rather than the dissolution of a 5-year union. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even shed a tear that might signal weakness to those vultures. I immediately signed the divorce papers, the ink drying like a seal on my past, packed up all my premarital assets, and walked out of that house with my head held high, leaving behind a hollow shell of a life I no longer recognized. The very next day, as my husband arrived at his manufacturing plant, expecting the world to bow to his new trajectory, the CFO informed him that the company had effectively gone bankrupt the night before. His empire, built upon the foundation of my own inheritance, had collapsed like a house of cards the moment I reclaimed my stake. My name is Hannah. If anyone ever asks me what exact moment makes a woman living in a seemingly normal marriage suddenly wake up to reality, I would tell them it was that Friday evening. It happened right as I turned off the stove, my hands still smelling of roasted garlic and rosemary, while a pot of the hearty beef stew my husband used to love, the one that defined our humble beginnings, was steaming on the kitchen island. That Friday was supposed to be a normal day. At least I thought it was. From morning till afternoon, I was as busy as always, drifting through the motions of a life I believed was secure. I had gone to the local farmer's market, hand-picking the freshest vegetables with a domestic contentment that now feels like a cruel mockery. I had even stopped by our machining and manufacturing plant, wandering through the clatter of heavy machinery, checking on operations with an owner's pride before heading home to cook. 5 years of marriage. For 5 years, I never once thought my family would fall apart. I met David back when he was just a regular machinist, a man with grease under his fingernails and a fire in his eyes. Back then, he had nothing but calloused hands and a dream of opening his own manufacturing facility. I, on the other hand, was an only child, raised with the quiet dignity of a family that valued substance over flash. My parents weren't billionaires with real estate empires, but my father owned a very stable, long-running industrial equipment supply company in Texas, and he taught me that wealth was a tool, not a personality. When I married David, my parents didn't object. In fact, they loved him, seeing in him the raw ambition that had defined their own youth. On our wedding day, standing in the golden light of the Texas sun, my father told me something I still remember to this day. A mantra that echoes in my mind whenever I doubt my own strength. Hannah, money can always be made again. But a man who knows how to hustle and work hard is what's truly valuable. Believing in those words, I took almost my entire trust fund and personal savings to help David launch his startup, $250,000 in cash, a long-term lease on an industrial warehouse in the Dallas suburbs, and 2 state-of-the-art CNC production lines. Add to that a roster of clients my father introduced to us, giving us the lifeline we desperately needed. Those were the foundation bricks of David's company, the literal building blocks of the man he became. The first few years were incredibly tough, a crucible of shared ambition. There were nights we slept on folding cots right on the cold, hard concrete floor of the warehouse, our breath mingling in the dark as we whispered about the future. In the Texas summer heat, sweat poured down our backs, and we laughed through the exhaustion, fueled by the singular belief that we were building a legacy together. During storm season, rain would flood right up to the loading docks, and we would spend hours desperately sandbagging the entrance, fighting nature itself to keep our dream afloat. But back then we were happy. At least I thought we were. The plant grew and the purchase orders multiplied. From 10 machinists to 30, from 30 to nearly 100 employees. David started wearing tailored suits, his stride growing longer, his voice gaining the sharp, clipped authority of a man who suddenly thought he was a king. He began meeting with major corporate executives, appearing at local Chamber of Commerce galas, while I quietly stepped back into the shadows, content to be the silent partner. I never liked the spotlight, I preferred the warmth of the kitchen and the satisfaction of a job well done. I believed my husband's success was our family's success until one day I started hearing the whispers, those venomous little insects that crawl into the ears of a wife who is finally starting to pay attention. At first it was just idle office gossip, the kind of chatter that usually drifts away with the wind. But then it grew louder, sharper, more specific. People kept mentioning a very young secretary named Vicky, only 19, pretty and sweet-talking, who always accompanied David on his business trips under the guise of necessity. Initially, I didn't care. I trusted my husband, or rather, I wanted to trust him so badly that I ignored the mounting evidence of his waning devotion. But that trust began to fracture under the weight of his increasingly elaborate lies. There were nights David came home incredibly late, sometimes 2 a.m., sometimes near dawn, smelling of cologne that was not his own and carrying the scent of expensive gin. When I asked, he claimed he was entertaining clients, his eyes never meeting mine. When I called, it went to voicemail, a digital dead end that left me staring at the ceiling in the dark. Texts took hours to get a reply, always filled with the curt, rehearsed language of a man preoccupied with something else. Once I accidentally saw a faint smudge of lipstick on his collar, a garish shade of red that burned my eyes. David brushed it off, laughing that a female client had accidentally bumped into him, his tone so dismissive that I felt small for even asking. I let it go. I let a lot of things go because I didn't want my marriage to shatter, terrified of acknowledging that the man I had built from the ground up had outgrown the foundation I provided. I poured my love into the home, into the meals, into the silence, hoping it would be enough to bring him back to earth. Until that evening, the evening my entire life changed. David walked through the front door and slammed his leather briefcase onto the entryway table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness, and for the first time he didn't even look at the stew, he just looked at me with a detached, cold indifference that signaled the end of everything. Bench. The sound echoed loudly. I was still holding a crystal wine glass in my hand, its slender stem trembling ever so slightly between my fingers, while the rhythmic clinking of the cutlery I had been laying out for our dinner seemed to mock the sudden decay of my world. I turned, my movements heavy as if I were wading through deep, cooling wax, my eyes seeking his for some sliver of the man I had tethered my soul to for half a decade. Before I could even force the muscles in my throat to swallow the lump of impending dread or whisper a query as to whether his exhaustion was the culprit of this sudden frost, David looked at me. His eyes were not merely cold. They were hollow, two dark wells reflecting a void where once there had been warmth, ambition, and a shared dream. I want a divorce. For words. For syllables that struck with the clinical precision of a scalpel, carving through the connective tissue of 5 years of sacrifice and devotion, driving straight into the marrow of my chest. I stood frozen, my reflection caught in the polished surface of the dining table. A woman staring at a stranger. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud. I didn't beg for explanations. I didn't let the hot, jagged tears of betrayal sear my cheeks. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scream to mark his victory. I simply looked at him, feeling a strange crystalline calm settling deep within my marrow, an icy clarity that surprised even me. Perhaps in the hidden subterranean chambers of my subconscious, I had been bracing for this exact tectonic shift for months. My mother-in-law, who had been ensconced in the armchair like a queen of a failing kingdom, immediately set her teacup down upon the saucer with a sharp, definitive click. What sent a shudder of disbelief through me wasn't her lack of protest. I had long suspected her love for me was as conditional as her son's, but the way her thin, painted lips curled into a smile. It was a smile of total, unadulterated satisfaction. The look of a strategist who has finally seen the final piece of a puzzle snap into place. "It's better you two get this over with early," she chirped, her voice light, devoid of the gravity the situation demanded. When a man becomes successful, he needs a younger, more vibrant woman by his side. Her words landed like leaden stones. I stared at her, mesmerized by the grotesque transformation of her face. This was the woman who had once clutched my hands in the sanctuary of this very kitchen, her eyes brimming with grateful tears as she thanked me for pouring my youth and my savings into helping her son climb the corporate ladder from the dirt up. The woman who used to toast to me as the cornerstone, the pride, the backbone of the family, was now observing me with the detached, dismissive scrutiny one might reserve for an expired warranty or a garment that had lost its luster. My father-in-law, a man whose silence I had always mistaken for wisdom, shifted in his recliner and chimed in, his voice rasping with a practiced, hollow empathy. "Hannah, don't blame anyone," he urged, his hands clasped over his belly. "You and David have been married for 5 years and still don't have kids. He wants an heir to pass his legacy to, and that's perfectly normal." I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in my chest, a dark, jagged sound that I stifled before it could escape. The irony was a jagged blade. For 5 years it was David, not I, who had insisted on delaying parenthood, masking his selfishness as professional ambition, claiming our life wasn't yet structured enough for the chaos of a child. And now the narrative was being rewritten in real time, the blame shifting seamlessly onto my shoulders to justify his abandonment. Before I could mount a defense, David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with cold efficiency. He opened a photo and slid the device across the kitchen island, a barrier between us that felt more like a demilitarized zone. "This is Vicky," he stated, his tone as flat as an invoice. I looked at the screen, and the image seared into my retinas. A girl little more than a child, draped in the trappings of manufactured luxury, her face obscured by heavy filters and a smile that reeked of vanity and unearned confidence. David looked at me, his gaze entirely devoid of affection or the history we had woven together. "I'm going to marry her." The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense, pressurized by the sudden collapse of my reality. My mother-in-law nodded with a frantic, bird-like eagerness, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of a new malleable toy to manipulate. My father-in-law leaned back, looking thoroughly pleased with the efficient resolution of his son's domestic crisis. I stood there, silent and still. In that moment, a profound, chilling realization dawned on me. The most agonizing part of betrayal is not the discovery of the infidelity itself, but the harrowing epiphany that the people you believed were your tribe, your foundation, had been standing firmly on the enemy's side of the line for years. David reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick manila folder, and slapped it onto the granite surface with a hollow thud. "I've already had the divorce papers drawn up," he said, his voice devoid of even a shred of remorse. "I keep the assets to manage the business. All you have to do is sign." I reached out, my fingers brushing the stark, unforgiving legal text. I slowly picked up the stack of papers, my eyes scanning the clauses, turning each page with a deliberation that unsettled him. As I read, a faint razor-sharp smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. It wasn't just a divorce, it was a raid. They wanted to strip me of every scrap of equity, every vestige of the life I had built from the ground up, leaving me a ghost in the ruins of my own ambition. But what David Actor and his wretched parents failed to grasp was that for the last 3 months, I had been the silent architect of my own contingency plan. Every secret ledger, every hidden digital trail, every vulnerability I had helped him build was now a weapon I held firmly in my grasp. Their current celebration was nothing more than the breathless, giddy prelude to a free fall, a plummet into a void they couldn't even begin to fathom. I gently closed the folder, the movement smooth and deliberate, and raised my gaze to meet theirs. I offered them a smile, polite, empty and terrifying. "All right, I agree to the divorce," I said, the words ringing out like a knell in the quiet room. All 3 of them froze, their smug complacency momentarily fractured by the lack of resistance. They didn't know that tomorrow morning a single confidential phone call, a call I had spent months ensuring would be devastating, would be placed. And when that call went through, the trajectory of the manufacturing plant bearing David's name would shift, spiraling into a completely different, darker direction. After uttering the words that sealed their fate, I didn't linger. I climbed the stairs, moving past them under my mother-in-law's triumphant, predatory gaze, my father-in-law's pathetic chuckles, and David's undisguised, arrogant smirk. In their limited, blinded worldview, I was a discarded object, a 35-year-old woman without a child, soon to be cast out of the life I had helped forge. What threat could a wounded animal pose? They had no idea that the most dangerous thing in this world is a person who has already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. I entered the sanctuary of our bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the dim, stagnant air of a room that once held the blueprints of my entire existence. Everything here was a physical manifestation of my devotion. 5 years ago, my hands had traced the soft, expensive fabric of these cream drapes, custom-ordered to match the subtle glow of the morning sun. They had smoothed the pale blue duvet, a sentimental wedding gift from my mother that I had tucked in with such fragile, hopeful care. Even the bedside lamps, with their delicate, brushed metal finishes, were trophies from a rainy, laughter-filled afternoon in Austin, a memory that now tasted like copper and ash. The room was a museum of a marriage that had already rotted from the inside. Yet the walls stood firm, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding beneath them. My phone vibrated against the mahogany nightstand, the screen flaring like a silent beacon in the gloom. 20 unread messages. Every single one originated from Liam, the grizzled, iron-willed veteran of our production floor, who had been the backbone of the company while David played executive. I tapped into the final message, the blue light reflecting in my widened eyes. Hannah, I have all the files prepped just like you asked. Give the word and we pull the trigger. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, savoring the weight of the moment. With a steady finger I typed back, the letters appearing as stark as a death sentence. Get everything ready, Liam. I think it is time. Before the glow could even dim, the phone chirped to life, Liam's gravelly, deeply lined voice cutting through the quiet of my sanctuary. Hannah, he began, his tone heavy with a decade of unspoken loyalty. Are you absolutely sure about this? We are talking about scorched earth. I leaned back against the headboard, feeling the cool polished wood bite into my spine. My gaze drifted to the window, where the streetlights hummed with a synthetic, flickering life. Yes, Liam. I've watched the rot spread for 2 years, feeding on my life, my money, and my pride. I simply refused to be the last one to acknowledge the stench. There was a heavy, mournful pause on the other end. I've seen everything happening, Hannah. I just didn't feel it was my place to speak, being just an employee. I'm just so sorry it came to this. Everything has an expiration date. Liam, I murmured, my voice devoid of the tremors I expected to feel. The universe has a funny way of balancing the scales when you stop trying to fix what was never meant to last. But are you certain? He pressed, his concern genuine and raw. Yes, I answered. It was so instantaneous, so devoid of hesitation, that it momentarily startled me. But the surprise evaporated as quickly as it had surfaced, replaced by a crystalline clarity. My heart, once a frantic, bleeding thing, had reached a point of absolute, frozen stillness. After the line went dead, I reached down and slid open the bottom drawer of my vanity. Tucked behind the velvet-lined dividers lay a heavy, midnight black binder, the tombstone of my naivety. I pulled it out, feeling the substantial weight of the documents held within. The original deed to this house, the purchase agreements for the CNC production lines that David had desperately wanted but never had the credit to secure, the thick stack of invoices for the heavy machinery, and the pristine bank receipts of the initial $250,000 wire transfer. Every single document was tethered to my name, or to the LLC that existed solely because of my foresight. My father had been a man of iron and ink. He had always insisted that trusting a man was a luxury, but maintaining a paper trail was a necessity. I had once called him a cynic, A man who saw ghosts in every shadow. Now, as I traced the gold leaf lettering on the spine of the binder, I realized that a seasoned veteran sees further than a child blinded by the saccharine glow of infatuation. At precisely 10 o'clock, the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel shattered the silence. I rose and drifted toward the window, watching as a white luxury SUV glided to a halt by the curb. The door swung open and out stepped Vicky, an apparition of cheap ambition. She was draped in a mini dress that left little to the imagination, her hair a cascade of artificial curls, her face a mask of heavy, calculated makeup. She clutched a Chanel bag as if it were a shield against her own irrelevance. I watched from the shadows, a ghost in my own house. Vicky marched to the front door, bypassing the bell with a brazen, possessive confidence that told me she already felt like the queen of this domain. I heard the muffled chaos below. My mother-in-law, usually so dignified, practically sprinted to the entryway, her voice shrill with glee. Their laughter rose like smoke, curling up through the vents. Come in, the older woman cooed, her words laced with a sickening sweetness. I saved you some dessert. Tomorrow we are going to look at bridal jewelry, something much more fitting for you. The betrayal hit me, but it didn't burn. It was a cold Arctic chill that settled deep in my marrow. David appeared then, his movements fluid and tender as he relieved her of her bag. He looked at her with a soft, adoring expression. The very same look that had once been my anchor. The look that had made me believe I was building a future with a man of character. Watching him now, I didn't feel the sting of loss. I felt the disgust of realizing I had been loving a reflection in a broken mirror. Half an hour of their jubilant, delusional planning later, the air in the house felt heavy enough to choke. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and opened the bedroom door. My footsteps were soft, rhythmic, a slow descent into the heart of their lie. As I rounded the corner of the landing, the chatter below stopped mid-sentence. All four of them froze, their eyes locking onto mine with varying degrees of hostility and shock. My mother-in-law's face contorted into a mask of pure irritation. "What are you doing down here?" she hissed, as if I were a stain on her perfect evening. "Getting water," I replied, my tone as flat and calm as a frozen lake. Vicky, sensing the tension, immediately pressed herself against David's chest, her fingers curling into his shirt in a pathetic display of territorial performance. She looked at me not with shame, but with the smug superiority of someone who thinks they have won the prize. David, seemingly emboldened by her touch, straightened his posture and fixed me with a look of patronizing pity. "Hannah," David said, his voice dripping with forced gentleness, "Vicky and I are going to get our marriage license as soon as our paperwork clears." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking at him with eyes that were now entirely empty of the devotion he had so easily discarded. "Okay," I replied, and the word held the weight of an oncoming avalanche that he had yet to hear. David's face darkened, the muscles in his jaw tightening into a knot of irritation. He had been bracing himself for a spectacle, a histrionic performance of tears, shattering glass, or the shrill accusations of a woman scorned. He craved that chaos. It would have validated his own narrative of being the stifled victim, the man forced to break free from an incompatible burden. Instead, my chilling indifference left him hollow. A predator suddenly denied his prey. He looked as if he wanted to reach out and throttle a reaction out of me, but I remained an immovable, icy object. Vicky, sensing his frustration, leaned into her role with practiced elegance. She smoothed the lapel of his jacket, her face composed into a mask of false, saccharine pity. "Hannah, I know this hurts you, but you can't help who you fall in love with. Love isn't a crime," she murmured, her voice dripping with that manufactured, honeyed sympathy that serves as the universal anthem of the homewrecker. A bitter, cold laugh almost escaped my lips. It was such a tired, pathetic script, the same lines recited by every woman who thinks she has won a prize, oblivious to the fact that the prize is merely a reflection of her own lack of integrity. I locked eyes with her, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and suffocating. "You're right," I said, my voice steady and sharp as a surgeon's blade. "Love isn't a crime, but actively destroying someone else's family definitely makes you trash." The effect was instantaneous. The pristine, saintly smile on Vicky's face disintegrated, replaced by a flash of raw, wounded vanity. My mother-in-law, a woman whose arrogance was matched only by her entitlement, slammed her palm against the kitchen counter with a resonant, jarring thud. "Who do you think you're talking to?" she hissed, her eyes wide with indignation. I didn't even bother to break my stride, merely shrugging with a casual, dismissive grace. "Whoever the shoe fits," I replied, not looking back. As I turned toward the stairs, a torrent of vitriol erupted behind me. Curses, shrill accusations, the desperate, unhinged barking of people whose power I had suddenly stripped away. I didn't care. I didn't hear. That night, I slept with the clarity of someone who has finally severed a gangrenous limb. It was the most profound, dreamless peace I had known in 5 agonizing years. The next morning, the sun bled through my curtains with the promise of inevitability. My phone vibrated against the nightstand. My father. His voice was grim, stripped of all pleasantries. "Have you thought this through?" he asked. "Yes, Dad," I answered, my heart feeling like a steady ticking clock. There was a pause, a thick humming silence that carried the weight of a lifetime of restraint. Then he sighed, a sound that signaled the end of a long, weary patience. "All right. From today on, I'm not holding back anymore." I knew the gravity of that declaration. For 5 years, he had swallowed his pride, watching from the sidelines as David made one amateur, greedy mistake after another. He had respected my marriage, hoping David would grow into the man I deserved, but that hope had turned to ash. Now he wasn't just a father-in-law. He was a titan of industry, a man whose mercy had reached its expiration date, and he was about to protect his own. The second call followed moments later. It was the bank. My portfolio manager's voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of emotion. "All documents processed, the legal machinery is officially active," he confirmed. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of my phone, a small sad smile touching my lips. Downstairs, the house was alive with the sickening sound of their euphoria. David was laughing, a coarse, booming sound that echoed against the walls. My mother-in-law was likely busy mapping out wedding seating charts, and my father-in-law was surely boasting to some distant relative about the arrival of an heir, desperate to solidify his legacy through a bloodline he barely understood. They were trapped in a bubble of their own making, blissfully unaware that the gears of consequence were already grinding toward their collapse. They thought they had reached the summit, but they were merely standing on a crumbling ledge before the landslide. They believed this was a victory. In truth, they were living out their final few hours of delusion. And when the walls came crashing down, the first one to realize the foundation was gone wouldn't be me. It would be David. That afternoon, he marched into the corporate headquarters with the swagger of a man who believed the world was bowing to him. He was a man possessed by his own vanity, dreaming of the luxury life he'd carve out with Vicky, the prestige of a new marriage, and the sweet, cold joy of discarding the wife who had stood by him during his humblest, hardest years. On his way, he had stopped at a jeweler to drop a fortune on a diamond, his ego ballooning every time a salesman congratulated him on his success. He felt like a king stepping into his domain. But as he pulled his car into the industrial lot, the air felt wrong. It was too still. The rhythmic, guttural roar of the manufacturing plant, the steady mechanical pulse of CNC machines, the cacophony of foremen, the relentless beeping of forklifts was absent. It was silent, a tomb-like stillness that made the hair on his neck stand up. He stepped out of his car, his brow furrowed, his eyes darting across the empty yard. The security guard, Stan, stood at the booth, but he didn't offer his usual sycophantic grin. He looked at David with a strange, pitying dread. "Why is it so quiet today, Stan?" David barked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. The guard shifted his weight, his eyes sliding away from David's face. Probably pick up again later, sir." The vague, hollow reassurance hung in the stagnant air, failing to reach the depths of David's growing unease. He felt the weight of the silence pressing against his eardrums, a sharp contrast to the mechanical symphony he had grown accustomed to. That dismissive answer, dripping with a strange, detached cowardice, left a bitter metallic taste in David's mouth, but he forced himself to swallow the rising tide of suspicion. With a sharp, dismissive wave, he strode toward the main office building, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete, a sound that felt strangely solitary, almost like a death knell in the void. Entering the lobby, the atmosphere was suffocating. He reached the second floor, the administrative hub that usually buzzed with the frantic, high-stakes energy of commerce. Instead, he found the accounting staff huddled in the narrow hallway like conspirators in a dark play. The moment they caught sight of his silhouette, they scattered, not with the casual indifference of subordinates, but with the frantic, jerky movements of cockroaches scurrying from a sudden light. A few cast furtive, terrified glances toward the floor, pointedly refusing to meet his eyes, as if his very gaze carried a contagion. A cold, serpentine chill coiled itself tightly around David's stomach, a visceral sense of dread that defied his bravado. He bypassed them with a brisk, aggressive stride, retreating into the sanctuary of his corner office, desperate to shut out the unfolding mystery. He pushed the door open, his eyes immediately locking onto the centerpiece of his mahogany desk. A thick, industrial-grade binder, sitting there with the sinister permanence of an altar. A scarlet label screaming in bold, unforgiving font, read, "Urgent Financial Audit." David felt a vein throb against his temple, a scowl carving deep lines into his forehead. He sank into his executive leather chair, the familiar creak offering no comfort, and pried the binder open. His eyes darted across the pages, searching for the validation he craved. Within 3 minutes, the smug, effortless smile that had defined his public persona for years withered and died, leaving his face gaunt and pale. The numbers were not just wrong. They were a cruel mockery of the reality he had meticulously constructed in his own mind. Quarterly revenues had cratered into an abyss, a precipitous drop that defied economic logic. Major anchor clients, the pillars of his empire, had systematically halted their orders, leaving his production lines gasping for air. The operating cash flow was bleeding out in vibrant, terrifying crimson. And then the final blow. 3 short-term bridge loans, looming like executioners, were maturing by the end of the month, demanding a total sum of nearly $2 million, a mountain of debt he hadn't even known existed. David read the pages again, his vision blurring, his mind frantically scrambling to dismiss them as a clerical error. It was impossible, a fever dream. He snatched up the receiver, his fingers trembling with a frantic, uncharacteristic fury, and roared for Tom, the CFO. Tom, a man who had weathered 8 years of David's whims, shuffled in, his face etched with the gray, weary exhaustion of a man who had been carrying the world on his shoulders while his captain slept at the wheel. "Explain this to me," David bellowed, slamming the binder onto the mahogany surface with such violence that a pen set rattled against its tray. "What the hell is this? What have you done?" Tom let out a ragged, shuddering breath, his shoulders sagging. "I sent you this projection 3 months ago, David. 3 months ago. I put it on your digital dashboard. You never even clicked the link." "Yes, but that was just a worst-case scenario," David countered, his voice rising into a pitch of desperate denial. "Truth is, the company started hemorrhaging cash back in January," Tom replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Raw material costs spiked beyond our margins, key clients reduced their volume, and several of our biggest contracts were unceremoniously canceled mid-peak production. We've been running on fumes for weeks." David lashed out, his ego clutching at straws. I just signed a massive $800,000 contract last month. We are fine. Tom looked at him then, and it wasn't with anger, but with a profound, stinging pity that cut deeper than any insult. David, that contract was for $800,000, yes. But the client only paid a 10% mobilization fee, and our overtime production costs alone ate through that in a week. We are actually losing money on every unit we ship under that deal. We are paying them to let us work for them. David felt the room tilt. The floor seemed to lose its solidity. For the last 2 years he had treated the company like an ATM, outsourcing all financial oversight to Tom and his team while he indulged in the vanity of the executive lifestyle. He had spent his days whining and dining clients, perfecting his golf swing, and preening at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, honestly believing he sat atop an unstoppable cash cow. The reality, he now realized, was a slaughterhouse where he was both the butcher and the lamb. His cell phone jarred him from the stupor, the bright, cheerful jingle sounding grotesque in the somber room. It was Vicky. Her voice, usually a light, bubbly melody, chirped through the speaker with terrifying carelessness. "Babe, I just saw the most amazing penthouse condo downtown. It's only $1.2 million. Can you wire me $25,000 for the earnest money to hold it? I want to put the offer in today." David froze, his breath hitching. A month ago, $25,000 was nothing, pocket change for a weekend getaway. Right now, it felt like a coarse rope tightening around his windpipe. "Let me look into it," he managed to choke out, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against glass. Vicky's tone soured instantly, the charm vanishing into cold, sharp impatience. "Look into it? You promised me, David. You said we were closing the deal on this place this week. What is your problem?" David rubbed his throbbing temples, the pressure behind his eyes blossoming into a blinding rhythmic migraine. "I'm busy right now," he snapped, and before she could protest, he hung up. The silence that followed was heavy and final. It was the first time since they had met that he had dared to assert a boundary, or perhaps the first time he had simply run out of patience for the fantasy. Outside his window, the Texas sky was bruising into a deep, sickly charcoal, the clouds churning with the promise of an impending violent thunderstorm. David sat paralyzed, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but for some reason my face, the face of the one he had pushed aside, flashed in his mind. For the last 5 years, whenever the company hit a roadblock, I was the first to sound the alarm. Whenever the payroll accounts hit zero, I was the one scrambling in the shadows, liquidating my own investments and cutting personal checks to ensure the staff didn't go unpaid. Whenever a hostile negotiation loomed, I was the one burning the midnight oil, meticulously drafting the contracts and strategies that he would eventually pass off as his own brilliance. He had always viewed my labor as his birthright, an endless resource he could drain without acknowledgement or thanks. He had never even bothered to know the cost of my devotion. Around 4 p.m. the office door creaked open, the sound barely audible over the growing hum of wind outside. It was Liam, the plant manager. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his posture shattered. "What do you need, Liam?" he asked, his voice a ghost of its former self. Liam walked to the mahogany altar, his movements measured and heavy, and placed a stark white envelope on the desk. "I'm giving my notice, effective immediately," he said, his voice hard as iron. David blinked, his mind struggling to process the string of disasters. "What? You're quitting? In the middle of this? Why?" Liam stared at him for a long time, his eyes heavy with a mixture of profound exhaustion and a burning, righteous indignation that simmered beneath the surface of his professional exterior, his gaze locking onto David's as if trying to impart a final bitter truth before the ship sank entirely. Disappointment. It was a look that stripped away the veneer of David's authority, exposing the hollow, brittle man beneath. Liam's voice, usually steady and rhythmic like the machines on the factory floor, now carried a jagged edge of betrayal. "David, I have been here since day one. I watched Hannah drain her trust fund, penny by painful penny, work herself to the bone until her eyes grew dim, and sacrifice the vibrant bloom of her youth just to build this empire for you. And all the while I have watched you transform into a shadow, a man I no longer recognize, a man I can no longer bring myself to respect." David sat in a stunned, suffocating silence. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out by Liam's words. He opened his mouth, but his throat felt as though it were lined with broken glass. Liam was not finished. He had come to bury the past, not to bargain. The last 3 months while this company was trembling on the brink of collapse, drowning in the wake of your neglect, Hannah was quietly, tirelessly trying to plug the holes with her own remaining strength. And you? You were busy living a farce, jetting off to Cabo, cradling that teenage secretary in the sun while the ship went down. Every syllable Liam uttered landed like a physical slap, a stinging blow to David's pride that left him reeling. Did you truly think the men on the floor were blind? Did you think they didn't know? Liam scoffed, a sound devoid of mirth, echoing off the mahogany walls. We all knew. We saw it all. We just kept our mouths shut because we believed in Hannah's dream, not yours. David's knuckles turned white, his fists clenching so hard his nails bit into his palms. A violent, shameful red crept up his neck and flooded his face, but he was paralyzed. He could not form a single syllable of defense, for the truth was a jagged mirror held up to his soul, and he hated what he saw reflected there. Before walking out, Liam paused, his hand hovering over the cold metal handle of the door. He turned back one final time, his gaze lingering on the man who had squandered everything. There are some things in this life that once you throw them away, you can never buy back, he whispered, the finality of his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. The door clicked shut with a clinical final snap. David was left in the massive, suddenly freezing office, the silence ringing in his ears like a tinnitus of the soul. Outside, the rain began to batter the glass, a rhythmic, relentless weeping against the window pane. His phone buzzed on the desk, shattering the stillness. It was his mother. Her voice, when he answered, was frantic with a superficial, blinding ecstasy. "David, I just put down the deposit for the country club for the wedding reception. Everything is falling into place. Bring Vicky over for a celebration dinner this weekend. We have so much to plan." David stared blankly at the dark, weeping rain. For the first time in his life, the mention of the wedding brought no rush of vanity, no surge of excitement. Instead, a massive, suffocating wave of dread crashed over him, pulling him into a dark, freezing current. He felt as if a catastrophic force, a landslide of his own making, was hurtling toward him, and he realized with a sickening jolt that he had absolutely no power to stop the avalanche. Meanwhile, across town, I was sitting in a sleek, dimly lit downtown conference room, the air perfumed with the scent of old paper and ozone. My father sat to my right, his expression a fortress of solemnity, while Liam stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the gray, weeping skyline. Spread across the large, scarred oak table were dozens of legal files, documents I had quietly, meticulously safeguarded for years, awaiting this exact moment of reckoning. My father placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, his touch anchoring me to reality. He looked at me with eyes full of a soft, morning wisdom. "Hannah, you still have a chance to turn back. You can stop this." I looked at the towering stacks of paper, the cold ink that represented the story of my life, then turned my gaze to the rainy, blurred cityscape outside. After a few seconds, I slowly, deliberately shook my head. "Dad, I have given him way too many chances. He is a man who builds nothing, he only consumes." At that exact, chilling moment, a call from the bank pierced the silence. The content of that phone call made every person in the room freeze, the atmosphere turning to ice because it involved a massive, long-buried secret. A sum of money that even David, in his arrogant blindness, had never suspected existed. The bank's call hummed through the speakerphone while the room was so unnervingly quiet that I could hear the rain tapping against the glass like restless fingers. My father had just set his coffee down, the china clinking softly against the saucer. Liam was reviewing an equipment manifest, his jaw set. I was staring at the open binder before me, my heartbeat a steady drum in my chest. The caller was Megan, the senior corporate account manager who had shepherded our finances for years. She spoke with a clinical, methodical precision, maintaining her professional mask, but I could hear a subtle, trembling trace of hesitation in her voice. She was clearly aware of the treacherous, crumbling reality of my domestic life. "Hannah," Megan started, her voice tinny and remote. "I was reviewing the historical ledgers your attorney requested. There is a specific, peculiar transaction from 4 years ago. A $100,000 wire transfer from your personal trust account into the corporate operating account." "I remember it vividly," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal turmoil. "Well, it was never logged as a capital contribution or an owner's loan," Megan continued. "Your old accounting team miscategorized it entirely as gross revenue from a dummy invoice. If you need it, our legal team can provide the official wire traces and a sworn affidavit to correct the record." I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. I could see that day as clearly as if it were playing on a screen in front of me. 4 years ago, the plant had landed a massive, life-altering order from an oil field supply company. David had been so ecstatic he couldn't sleep, pacing the kitchen floor, his eyes wild with greed and hope. But when it came time to procure the raw steel, we were short. He had sat at our living room table, holding his head in his hands, trembling with the visceral terror that losing this deal would bankrupt us. I didn't think twice. I didn't look at the cost of my own future. I simply wired the money. I had even smiled at him, naive and tethered to a dream that wasn't mine, saying, "We're married, David. We don't need IOUs." Looking back now, that moment felt like watching a stranger act out a tragedy. The pathetic, hollow naivety of a woman blinded by the brilliant, false light of love. I thanked Megan, my voice devoid of emotion, and hung up. The room was a sanctuary of heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that settles in when the weight of truth finally collapses the walls of a lie. My father, a man whose silver hair mirrored the hard-won wisdom etched into the lines around his eyes, held my gaze with a piercing, unwavering intensity. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, stripping away the pretenses of the afternoon. "You see, Hannah, people do not simply transform in the dead of night, shedding their skin like serpents. They erode, bit by bit, through 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 whispered untruths, and 1,000 instances where you chose to trust the light in them, assuming foolishly, dangerously, that they possessed a conscience to guide them." I stared down at my hands resting limply in my lap. These were the very hands that had prepared countless meals for David, pouring love into his nutrition while he focused on his empire. These hands had meticulously signed the commercial leases that birthed his success, wired our personal savings to pull him from the precipice of financial ruin, and cradled his aging parents through their most agonizing winters. And for all that labor, for all that devotion, I had been discarded like refuse left at the curb. The dull ache of betrayal that had plagued my chest for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. There was no warmth left, only the chilling stillness of ice. I turned slowly toward Ben, my attorney, whose presence was a silent anchor in the storm. "Ben," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that once defined my interactions with David, "attach that $100,000 to the asset reclamation filings immediately. Furthermore, trigger a comprehensive forensic audit of every major transaction executed within the last 5 years. Whatever belongs to me, whatever was misappropriated under the guise of marital necessity, I want it unearthed and reclaimed. Proceed with surgical precision by the book and leave no stone unturned." Ben inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Understood, Hannah. The bank's paper trail is a definitive map, It is a slam dunk in this jurisdiction, but you must steel yourself. When David receives notice of this, the blowback will be seismic. I felt a faint, sharp smile tug at my lips. Let him ignite. I was finished with the act of backing down. The coward in me had died alongside my marriage. My father watched me, his eyes brimming with a poignant blend of sorrow and pride. A recognition of the little girl who once burst into our kitchen after school, now replaced by a woman calculating the systematic dismantling of a man who had treated her life as his expendable currency. Life, I realized, was a merciless teacher. Some truths can only be inscribed upon the soul by the searing heat of the fire you must walk through alone. Back at the industrial plant, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stagnant ambition. David was teetering on the edge of sanity, after Liam, his most loyal foreman, had walked out with a finality that echoed through the empty bays. David had spiraled into a frenzy of panicked communication. He dialed his sales directors, his production leads, and his chief accountant, his fingers trembling against the glass. Half of them didn't pick up, their silence a deafening testament to their shifting allegiances. The others offered only vague, evasive murmurs, the language of those distancing themselves from a sinking ship. David had lived his life as the center of gravity. He was addicted to the ritual of entering the floor and feeling the immediate, reflexive deference of his staff. He had nurtured the arrogant belief that he was the irreplaceable king of his own making. But as the architecture of his power slipped through his desperate fingers like fine desert sand, the harrowing realization dawned upon him. His influence had been a phantom, a construct built entirely on a foundation that had never truly belonged to him. At precisely 5 o'clock, as the shadows lengthened across his mahogany desk, Vicky waltzed into the office. She did not knock. She simply breezed in, a whirlwind of entitlement, holding her phone with a petulant pout. "David, why exactly hasn't that money been wired? The realtor has called twice, and she's warning me that someone else is poised to snap up the condo." David looked up, his eyes bloodshot, the capillaries strained by the sheer, crushing pressure of the day. "Vicky, please, the company is mired in a legitimate crisis today. The condo is a secondary concern that will simply have to wait." Vicky froze, her expression shifting from irritation to genuine shock. It was, in all likelihood, the inaugural instance of David denying her a whim. She marched over, placing a manicured hand firmly upon his shoulder, her nails digging in slightly. "What is wrong with you? Didn't you promise me that once you divorced the old ball and chain, everything would be yours? You assured me you would hold the house, the plant, the wealth. So, tell me, what is a $25,000 deposit to a man in your position?" David violently shoved her hand away, the sudden aggression startling them both. "I told you it has to wait." Vicky's face transformed instantly, the sweet mask melting into a visage of sharp, venomous resentment. "Are you raising your voice at me?" David stood, his chair skidding backward as he began to pace the confined space, a caged animal sensing the closing bars. "I am not yelling, but do you have the faintest clue what is currently happening to my business?" Vicky crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "I don't know or care about your business failures. You made a promise. If you cannot provide the lifestyle you swore you would, why on earth did you make me waste my time waiting for you to finalize that divorce?" The words landed like the impact of a freight train, crushing the breath from his lungs. In that singular, terrible split second, the facade disintegrated entirely, and David finally perceived the hollow, transactional nature of the girl he had sacrificed his life for. Yet his ego, that fragile, bloated thing, and his desperate, pathetic craving to be idolized by a younger woman forced him back into a state of delusion. He convinced himself this was merely a temporary temper tantrum. Lowering his voice to a placating, weary register, he murmured, "Vicky, listen to me. Let me just resolve these momentary cash flow complications and I will see to it. Promise." Vicky stared at him, her gaze cold, unimpressed, and then she released a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence of the office. David, I am not some naive child you can distract with empty platitudes. A woman of my standing requires tangible security. Security is not a promise, David. Security looks like liquid cash. Deed and a diamond ring, not empty promises. She grabbed her purse, the leather strap biting into her palm, as if she were clutching the very leverage she now held over his collapsing reality. She spun on her heels, the sharp click of her designer stilettos echoing against the marble floor like a countdown to his inevitable downfall. With every stride, she moved further away from the wreckage of his ego, leaving David standing in the hollow center of his office, his face flushed with a mixture of incandescent rage and a burgeoning, icy bewilderment that chilled his blood. That night, the sanctuary of his home felt suffocating. As David stepped into the massive, echoing living room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the cloying perfume of his mother's vanity. She was surrounded by a small circle of neighbors, her laughter cascading through the cavernous space, brittle and triumphant. She was holding court, regaling the room with grandiose fictions about her son's impending union with a young, beautiful socialite, her voice rising in pitch as she callously dismissed his former wife. She painted Hannah as a frigid, uninteresting woman, a relic of a past that needed to be scrubbed away, claiming she lacked the spark to keep a man like David, an assertion that made the truth feel like a jagged stone in his throat. David walked into the light, his presence casting a long dark shadow that seemed to dampen the room's festive spirit. His face was a mask of thunderous clouds. Upon seeing him, his mother's face beamed with a predatory pride. "You're home, darling. I was just telling the ladies about your wedding to Vicky. I am thinking we should host a massive, lavish event at the country club. We really must show the world how well you are doing, how far you have climbed." "Mom, drop it." "Not right now," David muttered, his voice raspy and drained, the weight of the day's failures pressing down on his shoulders. His mother's expression soured instantly, shifting from adoration to offended disbelief. "Why ever not? You are a divorced man, free as a bird. What on earth are you waiting for?" His father, who had been buried behind the rustling pages of his newspaper, lowered it slowly, his gaze severe and judgmental. "A real man is decisive, David. Vicky is young and temperamental. If you drag your feet, she might just slip through your fingers and change her mind." Hearing his father's words only served to nauseate David further. The hypocrisy was a bitter bile rising in his chest. He dared not utter the truth, that his company was hemorrhaging capital, that the empire he had built was a house of cards leaning precariously against a storm. He had spent half a decade curating the image of a self-made titan, the kind of man who could discard a devoted wife like a stained garment and still preside over a castle. To admit his insolvency was to shatter the pedestal his parents had placed him upon. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed," he mumbled, turning away, desperate for the dark anonymity of his room. But his mother was not so easily dissuaded. "Did Hannah finally get all her wretched junk out of here?" she demanded, her tone dripping with disdain. "I want to have contractors in here by dawn to rip out those hideous carpets and repaint every inch of this place so everything is fresh and clean for Vicky." David stopped dead on the bottom stair. A sudden sharp chill racing down his spine, settling deep in his marrow. The mention of the carpets and the paint sparked a terrifying dormant memory. He realized with a sickening jolt that the deed to this sprawling McMansion was not in his name. It was in Hannah's. She had purchased it with her own private trust fund long before they were ever legally bound. His name appeared on a few trivial utility bills, but the title, the mortgage, the wire transfers, every fundamental brick of this home belonged to her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. If he did not even legally own the roof over his head, what did he truly possess? David didn't sleep a wink that night. The silence of the house was deafening. In a frantic, desperate bid to salvage his facade, he called a dozen of his closest golfing buddies, hoping to secure short-term bridge loans to plug the gaping holes in his accounts. Every single one of them, usually so eager for his proximity, politely declined. Some claimed they were illiquid due to bad market timing. Others promised they would check back next month. One prominent investor hung up the very second David mentioned the staggering dollar amount required. David sat in his home office until the first gray light of dawn bled through the windows. The urgent audit report sat on his desk like an executioner's warrant, nestled beside a phone that buzzed incessantly with vitriolic texts from Vicky, each one a sharp demand for the condo, the ring, or the cold, hard cash he no longer had. Meanwhile, Hannah, the woman who had quietly, invisibly solved every crisis he had ever faced, was gone, and the silence she left behind was louder than any of his demands. The next morning, while my father, my sharp-eyed attorney Ben, and I stood in the office of the notary, meticulously finalizing the asset reclamation orders, my phone vibrated against the mahogany table. I watched the screen, the name David flashing like a neon warning. I let it ring until it died. He called a second time, his persistence fueled by panic. I ignored it. On the third attempt, I finally answered, the silence on my end heavy and deliberate. Hannah, where are you? We need to talk. David's voice was a ragged, hoarse shadow of the man he once pretended to be. I looked down at the legal documents laid out before me, the ink of justice drying on the pages. My voice was perfectly, terrifyingly flat. We have absolutely nothing left to talk about, David. A long pause hung in the air, the silence stretching until it felt like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a brittle desperation. I know I said some harsh things the other night, but we were married for 5 years. There is no need to be this ruthless. I let out a soft, mirthless laugh that died in the sterile air of the room. David, when you shoved those divorce papers into my hands and told me to leave without a cent, did you even pause for a second to consider that we had been married for 5 years? Dead silence greeted me on the other end, the sound of a man realizing his own trap had finally closed around his neck. I spoke slowly, enunciating every word with cold precision. You wanted a divorce, David. I gave it to you. You wanted to marry Vicky. I am not stopping you from that catastrophe, but what is mine I am taking back. Every single cent. David's temper flared, a flicker of his old ugly self emerging. Hannah, do not push me. I looked out the window where the sky was bright, clear, and utterly indifferent to his plight. I'm not pushing you, David. I'm just letting you fall. I hung up. But what I didn't know was that immediately after that call, David would embark on a descent into a private hell of his own making. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of wounded pride and genuine panic, he abandoned the safety of his office and careened through the city traffic like a man possessed. He drove with a frantic intensity, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of justifications. He convinced himself that I was merely a shadow of the woman I used to be, a submissive, predictable creature incapable of orchestrating such a coup. He needed to reach the bank, not just to check the accounts, but to validate his own crumbling reality. He needed to see the numbers in black and white to prove that his kingdom remained untarnished. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, the very foundation of his life would disintegrate, and the secret illicit maneuvers he had spent years hiding in the dark would become the cold steel bars of his own prison. As for me, the silence I retreated into after our conversation was not one of emptiness, but of profound, cleansing liberation. Having severed the last tether to his volatility, the air around me felt suddenly light, almost crystalline. It is a peculiar phenomenon. While you are trapped within the orbit of someone like David, their petty grievances and manipulative outbursts consume the very oxygen of your existence. But the moment the cord is snapped, the moment you decide that you are no longer a participant in their theater of the absurd, their threats transform into nothing more than white noise. The storm was raging outside, yet inside my heart, there was only a serene, unshakable stillness. My father, Ben, stood beside me as a pillar of unwavering resolve. Together we navigated the meticulous, quiet rhythm of our legal strategy. We sat with the notary, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the sharp precision of ink. Every clause was scrutinized. Every invoice, those silent witnesses to David's negligence, was cross-referenced until the truth stood undeniable and stark. I realized then that I was not seeking vengeance but restoration. Tears would have been a poor armor, and nostalgia a dangerous distraction. I chose instead the cold, impenetrable shield of preparation. My safety was being forged in the fires of due diligence, layer by layer, document by document. Meanwhile, in the plush, marble-lined lobby of his primary bank, David's world began to buckle. He burst through the glass doors, his presence a jarring rupture in the professional calm of the VIP branch. He looked utterly undone. Gone was the pristine, untouchable CEO, who once glided through these halls with the arrogant grace of a conqueror. Now he was a man unraveling at the seams. His eyes were rimmed with the jagged red of sleeplessness, his expensive attire hung limply on his frame, and the erratic tilt of his head betrayed a man losing his grip on the narrative. Megan, the branch manager, felt the temperature in the room drop as he approached her desk. She remembered him as the golden boy of the tech sector, but the man standing before her was a ghost of that image. When he demanded the printouts, his voice lacked its usual command. It sounded brittle, desperate. As Megan navigated the screens, her brow furrowed, a flicker of professional alarm crossing her face. The words she delivered, about restricted accounts and frozen wires, hit David with the force of a physical blow. He lunged forward, the leather chair screeching against the floorboards as he surged to his feet. How dare they? He was the architect, the face of the company. But as Megan calmly laid out the legal reality, the undeniable fact that the capital he had gambled with was, in every legal sense, shielded by my trust and my separate holdings, the color drained from his face. The realization settled in his chest like lead. He had built his house of cards on land that never belonged to him. Just as his pulse reached a frantic, thudding crescendo, his phone began to vibrate, a relentless, buzzing reminder of the chaos spreading like ink in water. It was the procurement director, his voice distorted by panic, describing the collapse of their supply chain. The steel suppliers hadn't just paused. They had turned their backs, calling in the entirety of the debt. $1 million. The sum hung in the air, mocking David's long-held ignorance. He had lived in a fool's paradise, blinded by the vanity of gross revenue, never looking down to see the abyss of debt beneath his feet. In a daze he dialed Tom, his CFO, the man he expected to be his lifeline. But Tom's voice was devoid of the usual deference. It was the voice of a man who had already escaped the sinking vessel. Hearing that Tom was signing his exit papers was the final fracture in David's composure. He stood there, alone in the center of the lobby, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that were no longer his to claim, his knees trembling as the gravity of his isolation hit him. He had spent years discarding the very person who kept his world afloat, and now in his darkest hour, he had no one left to turn to. Just as he felt the walls of his reality finally collapsing, his phone chimed again. It was Vicky. Her voice was brittle, radiating a vapid, self-centered excitement that cut through his panic like a dull blade. David, I just found the most gorgeous Range Rover at the dealership. It's the limited edition, David, the one with the hand-stitched leather interior we talked about. I'm already here with the salesperson, and I think it's the perfect pick-me-up for this week, don't you? David pressed the heels of his palms into his throbbing eye sockets, the air in the lobby feeling heavy, almost suffocating. Vicky, he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. I am not in the mood for cars. I am dealing with a catastrophic crisis, and I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. There was a sharp, impatient intake of breath on the other end. You are always dealing with a crisis, David, she snapped, her tone shifting from airy excitement to jagged annoyance. You haven't even texted me all morning to check in. And I already told you that the business is having some operational friction. Vicky went silent for a few heartbeats, the kind of silence that feels like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of a room. Then she asked the question, a cold, calculated blade that sliced through the remaining threads of his composure. Do you still have money? David froze. The lobby around him, with its polished marble floors and gold leaf accents, seemed to tilt. A sickening realization, cold and viscous, washed over him, drenching his soul in the icy water of truth. For years, he had lived under the delusion that Vicky loved him for his ambition, his spark, his very essence. But in the harsh, sterile light of this moment, he saw the pattern clearly. Every whisper, every touch, every declaration of affection had been tethered to the rising tides of his bank account. Her vocabulary was a curated list of status symbols: condos, cars, diamonds, weddings, and cold, hard cash. David swallowed hard, his throat tight with a mixture of grief and mounting terror. If the company goes under for a little while, he whispered, his voice trembling with the desperate hope of a drowning man, will you wait for me? Dead silence. It was a void that stretched into eternity. Then Vicky let out a small, sharp laugh. It wasn't the playful tinkling sound he used to adore. It was metallic, devoid of warmth, a jagged sound that confirmed his worst fears. David, stop joking, she said, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of terrifying sobriety. Seriously, are you broke? David couldn't answer. The words caught in his windpipe, choked by the shame of his own fall. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds, a lifetime of shattered illusions. Then, with a casualness that was more painful than a scream, Vicky hung up. No goodbye, no gentle parting, no shred of comfort, not even the most basic human inquiry as to whether he was holding on by a thread or already plummeting into the abyss. David slumped into a velvet lobby chair, his strength abandoning him entirely. For the first time in an age, he looked back, not at the heights of his ego, but at the bedrock of our early years. When the company was nothing more than a fever dream, I walked with him in the biting rain, sharing cheap umbrellas. I broke bread with him, eating salt-drenched instant ramen until our lips swelled, just to save a few coins. I had even sold my own car, the only thing I truly owned, to make sure his employees could get their paychecks. When his father had been hospitalized, I hadn't just visited. I had slept in a molded plastic chair in the waiting room for 3 days straight, my bones aching, my eyes gritty, holding his hand through the darkest hours. And Vicky? The moment the fountain of cash ran dry, the moment the golden goose stopped laying its eggs, she didn't just leave. She bolted, vanishing like smoke in a gale. That afternoon David drove home, but the house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a hollowed-out carcass. As he pulled into the driveway of the McMansion, his heart stuttered to a halt. What awaited him was a scene of clinical, terrifying efficiency. 2 massive moving trucks, their engines idling with a low, predatory rumble, were parked across the driveway. A crew of professional movers, dressed in utilitarian jumpsuits, were moving with mechanical speed, carrying out the life he had curated. The massive crystal chandelier from the foyer, which he had bragged about 1,000 times, was being lowered and crated as if it were mere scrap. The custom hardwood dining table, the centerpiece of every gaudy party he had ever hosted, was already secured inside the truck. David leaped from his car, sprinting across the lawn, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" he roared, his voice cracking. The foreman, a man with eyes as emotionless as stone, didn't even flinch. He simply handed David a clipboard bearing a court-approved, stamped manifest. Executing a repossession order, the man said flatly, "These items are the sole legal property of Miss Hannah Sterling." His mother rushed out of the house, her hair wild, screaming at the top of her lungs, a shrill, piercing sound that set the neighborhood dogs to barking. "Robbers! They're robbing us!" But when the foreman methodically showed them the legal documentation, the invoices, the wire transfers, the deeds, all clearly, undeniably in my name. His parents were struck dumb, their faces draining of all color. David stood on the driveway, his hands clenching and unclenching as he watched his life, his identity, and his pride being dismantled and packed into boxes. He finally understood, with a clarity that was blinding. For 5 years, he had strutted around as the king of the castle, puffing out his chest and demanding reverence. But the moment the real owner came to collect her due, he realized that everything he had bragged about, every luxury, every status symbol, had been a hollow facade built entirely on my dime. Late that evening, as the last truck pulled away, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the pristine lawn, the massive house felt like a tomb, a cavernous, echoing shell of his former arrogance. His mother collapsed onto a cheap, flimsy folding chair left behind by the crew, her wails turning into guttural, ugly sobs as she cursed the air. His father sat on the porch steps, staring at his trembling hands, pale and utterly silent. David just stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by empty spaces where trophies of his life used to stand. His phone buzzed, vibrating against his thigh like a trapped insect. An unknown number. He answered it, his voice a ghost of himself. It was Attorney Ben. "David, this is a courtesy call." The voice was cool and precise. "Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., my client and a repossession team will be arriving at the manufacturing plant to audit and seize her physical assets." David's chest tightened, a sharp, searing pain blooming behind his ribs. "All of them?" he managed to choke out. "Yes," the attorney replied, "including the primary CNC machining centers." David's heart plummeted, sinking deep into the pit of his stomach. He knew with a certainty that turned his blood to ice, that if those machines left the floor, the plant was effectively dead. It wasn't just a loss of equipment. It was the cessation of his existence as a businessman. And when that happened, the mountain of overdue debts, the snarling threats of pending orders, and the litany of furious clients would trigger an avalanche, one that would bury him alive under the rubble of his own failure. That night, David didn't sleep a single second. He sat in his now empty home office, the desk bare, staring at a cold, forgotten cup of coffee and the financial audit that had stripped away the final veneer of his success. Everything was unfolding with the terrifying speed of a landslide. He hadn't even had time to process his own monumental mistakes before the crushing consequences had ripped everything away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of a life that was never truly his to begin with. Downstairs, the house was filled with the discordant sound of his mother's frantic, high-pitched voice as she called relative after relative, weeping and playing the martyr. She spun a web of lies, painting me as a heartless, predatory monster out to destroy her son, claiming with performative agony that I was stealing things that were never mine, conveniently ignoring the paper trail that proved every cent had been mine all along. But what truly terrified her, what kept her voice trembling and her eyes darting around the empty room, wasn't the loss of the crystal chandeliers or the expensive furniture. It was the sudden dawning realization that the lavish, untouchable lifestyle they had enjoyed was nothing more than a fragile glass structure, and it had finally shattered under the weight of its own deception. She thought was her birthright never actually belonged to her family. The house, the cars, the social standing. It was all a facade, a fragile house of cards constructed entirely on the foundation of my family's generosity and my own hard work. For years, she paraded around the local country club with her nose in the air, acting the part of the matriarch of a grand, established dynasty. She cultivated an image of refinement, bragging incessantly about her genius son, David, as if his success were an inherited trait. She never once uttered the truth, that my parents were the ones who pulled David out of the muddy trenches of mediocrity, financing the ventures he now claimed as his own. She had built her ego on our sweat and tears. People are prone to getting far too comfortable while living on a pedestal, and in their arrogance, they inevitably forget who built the stairs they stand upon. At 6 a.m., the silence of the morning was shattered by a frantic, high-pitched ringing. David lunged for his phone, his pulse racing as he heard the panicked voice of his floor foreman. David, get down here now. What's going on? They're here. David bolted up, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath hitching in his throat. Who? The repo guys and the lawyers, the foreman barked, the sound of chaos already erupting in the background. 20 minutes later, the screech of David's tires against the asphalt announced his arrival at the plant. His face went pale as he looked out at the scene. 3 massive flatbed 18-wheelers were parked aggressively in front of the warehouse. A clinical team of lawyers, a stern-faced notary, and a crew of heavy machinery riggers were already at work, systematically unbolting the CNC machines from the production floor. Standing in the center of it all, bathed in the harsh morning light, was me. I stood perfectly still, wearing a simple beige pantsuit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, disciplined ponytail. My expression was as calm and detached as if I were reviewing a routine inventory check, utterly unfazed by the seismic shift occurring around us. In that moment, David stared at me as if I were a total stranger, a specter he didn't recognize. For years, he had only ever seen me in the kitchen, hovering in the living room, or receding into the background of his life. He had completely forgotten that long before I was his doting wife, I was a seasoned corporate executive, meticulously trained by my father to run and protect a global empire. David rushed over, his steps stumbling, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hannah. I turned around slowly, my eyes cool and devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted. Can I help you? He pointed a trembling finger at the riggers, who were expertly dismantling the massive CNC centers. Are you really going to do this? Are you really going to strip this place bare? I looked at the machines with a clinical eye. Those machines generated 80% of the plant's revenue, the very heartbeat of the business. They were also paid for in full by my personal LLC, documented in every filing. What do you suggest I do? I asked, my voice steady and devoid of malice. David clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together in a futile attempt to regain control. At least give me some time, he pleaded, his bravado crumbling. Time? I laughed softly, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the warehouse air. Did you lack time over the last 5 years, David? He choked on his words, the realization of his long-term neglect settling into his gut like lead. I stared at him for a long, heavy moment, then spoke with deliberate, measured pacing. David, if I were the one being thrown out of the house that night, would you have even considered giving me a second of time? He couldn't answer. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of the truth. We both knew exactly how it would have played out. If I hadn't prepared, if I hadn't meticulously kept the paper trail for every cent I invested, I would be rotting in a cheap motel right now while he popped champagne with Vicky. A head rigger stepped up, touching his cap. Miss Sterling, the serial numbers matched the manifest. We're ready to hoist. I nodded, my gaze never leaving David's terrified face. Proceed. The sound of drills and heavy, grinding chains echoed through the cavernous warehouse. Every sharp clank of metal was like a hammer smashing into the fragile architecture of David's skull. He stood there, his face completely drained of blood, watching his company get physically dismantled piece by piece, just as he had dismantled my trust. Just then, a sleek red Mercedes pulled up to the loading dock with a flourish. Vicky stepped out, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a dress that cost more than a month's rent, completely oblivious to the industrial apocalypse unfolding inside. When she saw the massive flatbeds and the gaping, empty spaces where the machines had been, she gasped. David, what is going on? David was too stunned to speak. Vicky scurried over, saw the machinery being loaded onto the trucks, and then glared at me, her face contorting with indignation. What are you doing? I looked at her, entirely unbothered, as if I were shooing away an insect. I am repossessing my legal property. Vicky scowled, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. Do you have to be such a vindictive, A few of the riggers, men who had seen many a business collapse, actually laughed out loud at the absurdity of her accusation. Even Attorney Ben, a man of few words, shook his head in absolute disbelief. It was likely the first time in Vicky's pampered life she was being forced to face the raw, unvarnished consequences of her actions. I looked at her with absolute icy zero pity. I agreed to the divorce exactly as David requested. I am simply and legally reclaiming assets that I paid for. I haven't insulted anyone, I haven't slandered anyone, and I haven't broken a single law. What exactly is vindictive about protecting my own interests? Vicky's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, because she knew deep down that I was right. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, finally boiled over in David. He grabbed Vicky by the arm, his grip harsh, and pulled her aside. Just go home. You're telling me to leave? She hissed, stung by his tone. I said go home, he roared, his voice cracking. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice at her in anger. Vicky jumped, visibly shaken. She stared at him for a few seconds, her face turning from confusion to ice-cold disdain. Fine, fix your own mess, she snapped. She spun around, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete as she turned to leave, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the legal team blocking the only exit from the production floor. Their folders ready, waiting for the next signature on the seizure order. Around, and the sharp screech of her Mercedes tires against the pavement sounded like a final mocking verdict. She did not cast a single glance back. She did not offer a hand to steady him, nor did she inquire about the crumbling empire that had been her golden pedestal. She didn't even bother to ask if he was breathing, let alone if he was okay. David stood frozen, his eyes locked on the dissipating glow of her tail lights as they bled into the gray morning mist, and in that fleeting second, a cold, hollow void erupted within his chest, expanding until it felt as though his very soul were being sucked into an abyss. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that vacuum of sound, his mind betrayed him, dragging him back to that harrowing year when a brutal accident on the factory floor had left him with a severe, life-altering concussion. He remembered the antiseptic tang of the hospital room, the rhythmic, agonizing beep of the monitors, and me, sitting steadfast by his bedside for 3 endless days and nights, refusing to leave even to wash the scent of sickness from my skin, my heart aching for his recovery. The cruel irony was not lost on him. The woman for whom he had incinerated our marriage, the woman for whom he had traded loyalty for a shallow, shimmering fantasy, couldn't even stand by him for 5 minutes of true, unfiltered hardship. By 10 a.m., the fragile facade of his world shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The front gates, once a symbol of his industrial prowess, were besieged by a snarling convoy of vendors and suppliers. They arrived not with the respectful deference usually afforded to a titan of industry, but with the feral desperation of men who had been defrauded. They clutched unpaid invoices like weapons, their faces contorted with rage, shouting demands for cash that no longer existed and brandishing the threat of lawsuits like daggers. The air grew thick with the stench of failure. Amidst this cacophony of accusation, David's phone let out a shrill, piercing ring. The bank. The voice on the other end was clinical, devoid of empathy, stripping away his dignity with every word. His commercial credit line had breached its covenants, the loan was being called in, and his presence was demanded at the branch before the sun began to set. David felt as if he were sinking into quicksand, a thick, suffocating sludge that pulled him under with every frantic movement. The plant was a carcass, his clients were ghosts, his vendors were circling like vultures, and the bank was the executioner preparing to swing the axe. By noon, the heavy-duty riggers had finished loading the flatbeds, the silence of the now vacant warehouse echoing with the ghost of a career destroyed. I signed the final release forms with a hand that remained steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. Attorney Ben, ever the portrait of professional efficiency, handed me the updated asset ledger, a document that signaled the absolute, meticulous fulfillment of my plan. Victory was within my grasp, yet as I turned to leave, the sharp buzz of my phone fractured the moment. It was Howard, the CEO of a premier construction firm in Texas, and one of our most venerable long-standing clients. I answered, expecting a routine inquiry, but within 5 minutes of his measured, grave tone, the world tilted on its axis. My expression, previously a mask of cool determination, collapsed into one of utter disbelief. What Howard unveiled was not merely a business complication, but a cavernous multi-million-dollar secret that had been festering beneath the surface for 2 years. A secret that implicated not just David, but the architect of his downfall, Vicky. The revelation left me anchored to my chair, the world spinning in silent, surreal slow motion. Howard had always dealt directly with me during the firm's rise, but after I stepped back to accommodate David's ego, the communication pipeline had been diverted through Vicky. I had dismissed it as a minor administrative shift, but Howard's confession recontextualized every interaction I had ever witnessed. "Hannah, I have to ask you something off the record," Howard had begun, his voice heavy with a weary, knowing gravity. "Did you know your company was issuing dummy invoices?" I froze, the blood draining from my face. "Dummy invoices?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Yeah," Howard sighed, the sound crackling through the receiver. "I figured you knew, which is why I never brought it up. But seeing the fallout now, I'm guessing you had no idea." I gripped my phone until my knuckles turned white, my voice barely a whisper. "Tell me exactly what happened, Howard." For the last 2 years, every time we renewed a contract, that young assistant of David's, Vicky, would ask us to adjust the invoice values. "Adjust how?" I demanded, my mind racing through columns of figures. "The actual cash we paid was higher than the number on the official contract you guys sent us." My stomach dropped, an icy pit of realization forming in my core. In the precision-based world of manufacturing, skimming a few thousand here and there across dozens of recurring contracts over 2 years didn't just add up. It amassed into an astronomical, life-changing fortune. I thought maybe David was building a slush fund for corporate lobbying or something, so I didn't pry, Howard continued, his voice thick with regret. But looking at how broke the company is, that money clearly didn't go into the business. After I hung up, I sat in a paralysis of shock. Ben, noting the sudden, ghostly pallor of my skin, leaned in. "What happened, Hannah?" I recounted every syllable of the conversation. When my father heard, his features hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "If that's true, we are talking about massive corporate embezzlement," he rasped. I nodded, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place. I remembered the endless parade of Chanel and Hermes bags that draped over Vicky's shoulder like talismans of her greed, the transcontinental excursions to Dubai, the diamond tennis bracelets that caught the light with every sycophantic gesture, luxuries a secretary on a modest $45,000 salary couldn't dream of, let alone afford. I had once confronted David, blinded by his own infatuation. He had dismissed my warnings, insisting that young girls simply had a penchant for finery, and that my observations were nothing more than the bitter, paranoid scribblings of a jealous ex-wife. Now, looking at the hollow shell of a company he had been forced to surrender, I realized that I hadn't just been replaced by a younger model. I had been robbed by an opportunist who had played the role of a siren to perfection, all while draining the lifeblood of our hard-earned legacy. The devastating reality was that some things don't just magically appear out of thin air, no matter how much David had tried to convince himself otherwise. That night, the air in my father's study felt heavy, charged with the static of impending justice. Ben and his forensic accounting team, their eyes glazed with the fatigue of the long hours, tore through the last 2 years of contracts with surgical precision. The results were not merely alarming. They were staggering. With every page turned, the scale of the betrayal expanded. In just the first 11 contracts they audited, they unearthed hundreds of thousands of dollars in off-the-books discrepancies. The total skimmed amount spiraled upward, approaching $1 million. a figure so clinical yet so violent that it silenced even my father. He looked at me, his gaze softening into a look of profound paternal concern. "Hannah, do you want to pursue criminal charges?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the cooling fans on the laptops. I stared at the stack of fraudulent invoices, the paper cold and crisp beneath my fingers, and slowly nodded. "Dad, I don't care about revenge, but I demand the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my core. Meanwhile, across town, David was living through a different kind of apocalypse. His plant, once the heartbeat of his daily ambition, was now a ghost town. The heavy machinery had been stripped away, sold off in desperate auctions. The employees, sensing the rot, had mass resigned, leaving behind only the hollow echoes of a failed empire. Lawsuits were flying in like arrows, and the friends who once clamored for his attention wouldn't even return his calls. That evening he dragged himself into his house, a place that used to feel like a sanctuary, but now felt like an empty, echoing cage. His mother was sitting at the kitchen island, her shadow long and sharp against the marble, looking furious. "David, I need the truth," she snapped as he stepped into the light, her voice a whip crack in the silence. "Are you hiding something from me about the business?" David collapsed onto a bar stool, the weight of the day crushing his shoulders. "Mom, please not now," he groaned, his head in his hands. She slammed her hand on the counter, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Don't not now me. The bank manager called me today. She said your company is drowning in debt." David looked up, his eyes darting with panic. "The bank called you?" His father walked into the kitchen then, his face grim, his stature rigid with suppressed anger. "Tell us the truth, David. How bad is it?" For the first time in his life, David found himself mute, the polished armor of his ego shattered. He couldn't even comprehend his own collapse. Seeing his silence, his mother's face flushed with a terrifying mounting panic. "David, speak. Are you going bankrupt?" "No," David shouted, jumping up, though the word died in the air, hollow and unbelievable even to his own ears. Right then his phone rang, the vibration harsh against the silence. It was Vicky. His mother saw the caller ID, and a flicker of hope crossed her eyes as she pushed him toward the device. "Answer it. Don't let the poor girl misunderstand what's going on." David hesitated, the screen glowing like a warning beacon, then picked up. Before he could utter a syllable, Vicky's voice cut through the speaker like ice on glass. "Where are you?" "At home. Come to my apartment. Now." "Why? What's going on?" "Just get here." She hung up, the abrupt dial tone signaling the end of his world. David felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, a cold, suffocating sensation. 40 minutes later, he unlocked the door to Vicky's luxury apartment, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he stepped into the living room, he froze, paralyzed by the sight before him. Sitting on the velvet sofa was a young, sharp-looking man in a perfectly tailored Zegna suit, wearing a Richard Mille watch that cost more than David's entire remaining payroll. Before David could form a coherent thought, Vicky crossed her arms, her posture radiating a cold, calculated distance. "David, this is Kevin." The man smiled smoothly, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Nice to meet you, David." The atmosphere in the room was toxic, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and betrayal. David looked at Vicky, his voice barely a tremor. "Who is this?" "We're seeing each other," Vicky said, her voice as flat and emotionless as a ledger sheet. It felt like a baseball bat to the ribs. David couldn't draw a full breath. "What the hell are you talking about?" Kevin didn't even flinch, merely sipping his drink. "I think Vicky made it clear. David, we're together." David turned his furious, bloodshot gaze to Vicky. "And what about me?" Vicky rolled her eyes, a look of profound boredom passing over her features. "What about you? We aren't married. I can date whoever I want." David's blood boiled, the heat rising to his face in a searing wave. "I divorced my wife for you." I threw my life away for you. Vicky cut him off sharply, her eyes narrowing. Stop using that line. Nobody put a gun to your head and forced you to divorce Hannah. You chose that. The room fell dead silent, the air heavy with the weight of his own foolishness. Kevin sat there, entirely unbothered, making the humiliation even worse as he checked his watch. Honestly, David, Vicky sneered, her lip curling with disdain. I think we're done. I never promised I was going to marry you anyway. Every word sliced open a new artery in his pride. David stared at the woman he had burned his kingdom to the ground for, witnessing the mask finally slip to reveal the emptiness beneath. She wasn't even trying to hide her gold digging anymore. He suddenly remembered the warning I had given him once, a memory that now burned with the intensity of an open flame. Some people love you for who you are. Some people love you for what you can give them. When you lose everything, you figure out who is who. David stood there for a long time, the silence of the room mocking his past choices. Then, with a hollow, broken gait, he turned around and walked out. For the first time in his life, he felt the suffocating, absolute weight of his own insignificance, a realization that he had sacrificed everything for nothing, and he began to walk into the darkness, wondering how long it would take for the truth to finish him off. A profound, suffocating sense of hollowness, as if the very air around him had turned into liquid lead, pulling him down into the abyss of his own failures. He was like the biggest idiot on the planet, a man who had traded a crown of gold for a trinket of glass, only to watch that glass shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces against his own chest. But that realization, sharp and stinging as it was, paled in comparison to the seismic shift occurring in my office at that very moment. My legal team had reached the end of the labyrinth, their digital lanterns finally illuminating the dark corners where my stolen fortune had been hidden. Ben, my lead investigator, approached my desk with a heavy step. His face was a map of grim professional sympathy as he handed me the banking report. As I scanned the document, my breath hitched. The offshore account, that insidious sinkhole that had been swallowing my company's liquidity for months, did not belong to Vicky. It was not anchored to her vanity or her superficial schemes. It belonged to a phantom I never would have suspected. It belonged to my mother-in-law. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light washing out the color from my face. Time seemed to calcify. I sat in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Honestly, if the money had trickled into Vicky's manicured hands, I wouldn't have even blinked. It would have been a mundane tragedy. A vapid 19-year-old girl, obsessed with the hollow luster of designer brands and the fleeting status of a curated life, bleeding a gullible man dry. It was a story as old as time, a cliché of human greed. But seeing the name of the woman I had once called mother staring back at me from that hidden ledger, it didn't spark rage. It sparked a cold, numbing disgust that started in my stomach and crawled up my spine. For 5 long years, I had held that woman in a sacred place in my heart. When the scalpel bit into her back during her surgery, I was the one standing by her bedside, bathing her, her skin paper-thin under my touch, meticulously changing her bandages with the devotion of a daughter. When David's father suffered his stroke, I became a ghost in my own house, rising at the freezing hour of 6 a.m. to drive him to therapy, sacrificing my health to ensure his mobility. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, I had acted as the silent architect of their comfort, purchasing gifts for their sprawling extended family, masking my own exhaustion so they could feel pampered. I had never imagined that the woman who whispered "darling daughter" into my ear while clutching my hand was simultaneously reaching into my purse with her other, siphoning the lifeblood from the very company I had built with my own grit and inheritance. Ben pushed a printed ledger across the mahogany desk, his voice a low, steady hum of clinical detachment. "Hannah, we've unraveled it. Over the last 2 years there were 17 distinct wire transfers, meticulously routed through shell vendors to bypass the internal audits, landing directly into your mother-in-law's private account. The figures were sickening. amounts ranging from $30,000 up to over $100,000 per hit, totaling roughly $900,000. My father, who had been sitting beside me, a pillar of quiet strength, let out a long ragged sigh that sounded like the collapse of a dam. To actively sabotage your own daughter-in-law to this extent, to betray the hand that fed you while smiling at the dinner table? It's just pathetic. I didn't respond. My mind was a carousel of broken memories, now illuminated by the harsh glare of truth. I remembered her complaining about the roof needing repairs, her voice dripping with artificial distress. I remembered her dreamy monologues about wanting a vacation condo in Florida for her golden years. And I remembered how she would manipulate David, guilt-tripping him, planting the seeds of inadequacy in his mind, telling him he wasn't providing enough for his parents. Every time I had been the martyr, the one who quietly wrote the check, oblivious to the fact that I was being bled dry from both ends, a victim of a coordinated siege I had mistaken for love. Ben's phone vibrated, interrupting the stifling atmosphere. After a brief, clipped conversation, he hung up and looked at me, his eyes grave. "Hannah, one more thing." "What?" I managed to choke out. "The bank just informed us that David filed an emergency petition this afternoon to contest your ownership of the repossessed assets." I nodded, a grim smile touching my lips. It was expected. A drowning man will always claw at the air, even when he is already sinking beneath the surface. "The problem," Ben continued, his brow furrowed, "is that the petition includes a sworn affidavit from his mother. She perjured herself, Hannah. She's claiming that the initial seed money for your business was entirely David's, and that you were simply holding the assets in trust for the marital estate." My father let out a cold, sharp bark of laughter that echoed against the office walls. "Where is their proof?" "They have none," Ben said, his voice hard. The room fell into an absolute, deathly silence. We all knew exactly what this meant. This was no longer a simple divorce negotiation. It was a declaration of total scorched earth warfare against people who had chosen to bury themselves in a grave of their own lies rather than face the reality of their insignificance. Meanwhile, in the hollow shell of the McMansion, the air was stagnant and thick with the smell of dust and dying dreams. David sat in the center of the living room, the space too large, too empty, reflecting the cavernous vacancy in his life. His mother paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a frantic clock. "David, you have to figure something out. You can't let her take everything. She's ruining us." David leaned his head back against the cold leather of the sofa, exhausted to the very marrow of his bones. "Mom, do you think I haven't tried?" His father, slumped in an armchair nearby, scowled at the floor. "Is the company really that far gone?" David didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was a physical weight he didn't have the strength to lift. His supposed friends had vanished like smoke the moment the credit lines closed. His vendors were queuing up to sue him for unpaid debts. Vicky, the prize he had sacrificed everything for, had already pivoted, trading him in for a richer, more oblivious model. Everything was gone. "Don't worry," his mother said, her hands trembling as she smoothed her hair, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. "I'll go talk to Hannah. I'll make her see reason. She still respects me." David let out a dark, bitter laugh, a sound so jagged it seemed to cut through the quiet of the house. "You think she wants to hear a single word out of your mouth?" His mother froze, her pacing coming to a sudden, jarring halt. David looked at her, his eyes hollow, drained of all color and warmth. "The day I handed her those divorce papers, you were the happiest person in the room, Mom. You were the one telling her to leave with nothing, the one whispering in my ear that she didn't deserve a dime. You pushed me to marry Vicky, you cheered as I burned my life down. And now that the fire has reached your own skin, you want to go beg her for mercy? You want to go face the woman you spent years stealing from, and ask her to play the saint again?" Mother stood rooted to the spot, her lips trembling as she searched for a rebuttal that simply did not exist. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating, a physical weight that pressed against the walls. Deep down in the darkest, most shielded corners of her conscience, she knew the truth. If the roles were reversed, if she were the one cast out, stripped of dignity and discarded like a broken toy, she would never forgive such a transgression. She would have burned the bridge to ashes. That night, consumed by a tempest of shame and ruin, David sought solace in the bottom of a bottle. He drank until the sharp edges of his reality blurred, until the crushing weight of his failure became a numbing haze. It was 5 a.m. when the relentless buzzing of his phone pierced the gloom of his apartment. It was Tom, his former CFO, a man who had watched the empire crumble from the inside. "David, you need to see this," Tom urged, his voice grave. "See what?" David slurred, his tongue heavy with the lingering effects of the alcohol, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "I pulled a backup server log before I left. Everything is documented. Meet me at the diner on 4th Street. Half an hour later, David sat in a corner booth of the dimly lit diner, the smell of grease and stale coffee hanging in the air. His hands shook as he nursed a black coffee, trying to steady his nerves. Without a word, Tom slid a small silver USB drive across the scarred laminate table. "This has the shadow ledgers from the last 2 years, Tom whispered, his eyes darting toward the door. "What is on it?" David asked, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Tom looked at him, his gaze heavy with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "Look for yourself." David retreated to the sanctuary of his office, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He plugged the drive into his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys before he forced himself to click open the files. Within seconds, the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. The offshore accounts, the elaborate web of dummy invoices, the illicit wire transfers. The names danced across the screen in a blur of criminal intent. One column was Vicky, a portrait of opportunistic greed. The other column, far more devastating, was his own mother. Nearly $1 million had been siphoned away under his very nose. David read the numbers over and over, 10 times, 20 times, his brain refusing to process the betrayal, his logic shattering against the jagged reality of the evidence. He grabbed his phone, his grip so tight his knuckles turned white, and screamed into the receiver. "Mom, get up here now." 10 minutes later, his mother walked into the office. She saw the hollow look in his eyes and her breath hitched. She looked terrified, a ghost of her former imperious self. "What is wrong?" she stammered. David spun the laptop around, the screen glaring at her like an accusing finger. "Explain this." She looked at the glowing monitor and turned chalk white, clutching her chest as if she had been struck. "Mom, what is this money?" David demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "David, let me explain," she pleaded, her hands fluttering in the air like a wounded bird. "What is this money?" David roared, his voice cracking the stillness of the room. It was the first time in his entire life he had ever screamed at the woman who raised him. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her defenses finally crumbling. "I just wanted a nest egg," she wailed, her voice thick with self-pity. "I was scared of getting old. I was scared you wouldn't be able to take care of us." David stared at her, horrified, repulsed by the simplicity of her justification. $1 million, a nest egg. The words tasted like bile. His mother couldn't look him in the eye. She turned her head, hiding her face in her hands. In that moment, David felt the ground open up beneath him, swallowing him into an abyss of his own making. He had spent months believing Vicky's betrayal was the ultimate knife in the back. He had cursed her name, blamed her for the collapse of his world, and held onto the bitterness as a shield. But to discover his own mother, the woman who had constantly berated me for not being a good enough wife, who had held herself up as the moral arbiter of his marriage, claiming she only wanted what was best for her son, was the architect of this ruin? The irony was a jagged blade. In that agonizing, transformative moment, David realized the brutal, unvarnished truth. The only person who had ever genuinely protected his company, the only soul who had worked with integrity and vision, wasn't his mother, and it certainly wasn't Vicky. It was me, the woman he had thrown away, the partner he had discarded to appease the vanity of those around him. Right then his phone rang again, a jarring sound in the quiet room. It was his lead commercial banker. "David, I have bad news. Titan Construction just formally canceled their master service agreement with you." David slumped into his chair, the phone slipping from his nerveless fingers. That was it. The absolute last major contract keeping the company on life support was gone. He was a ghost presiding over a graveyard. And at that exact moment, I was walking into a private boardroom in a high-rise downtown, invited by a coalition of our former clients. The air in the city felt different today, crisp and full of possibility. This meeting would decide the fate of the manufacturing equipment I had seized, and it would also reveal one final pathetic truth about the man David had become. I arrived at the boardroom feeling far calmer than I had in the days immediately following the divorce. When you survive the worst of the pain, when you have walked through the fire and emerged with your soul intact, emotion is replaced by sheer, clinical clarity. I wasn't losing sleep over David anymore. I had stopped asking why the man I built a life with, the man who had promised to be my partner in all things, had turned into a monster. Some questions simply do not deserve answers. The reality of their actions, the greed, the theft, the deception is the answer. The executives in the room were some of the biggest industrial players in Texas. Men and women who had known me since the early days of our startup, long before the fame and the excess. Many of them had done business with my father, respecting the legacy he built and the work ethic I had inherited. They remembered me staying up until 2 a.m. negotiating supply chain logistics, sacrificing my own rest to save their margins during the height of the pandemic. When I walked in, they all stood up. There was no pretense, no performance. They greeted me with genuine, palpable warmth. It reminded me that true respect isn't derived from a fancy title, a custom suit, or the hollow accolades of society. It's earned through years of integrity, through the quiet, grueling work of doing the right thing when no one is watching. After a few minutes of small talk, Howard, the CEO of Titan Construction, leaned forward, his expression grave. "Hannah, there's something you need to know about how David was operating." I nodded, my composure steady, my mind ready for whatever truth lay ahead. "Go ahead." Howard looked around the table, ensuring he had the undivided attention of his peers. "About a year ago, my board wanted to sign a massive 5-year exclusive manufacturing contract with your plant." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a stark reminder of the years I had spent laboring under the delusion that we were building an empire together. I remembered that if that deal had gone through, our revenue would have tripled overnight, a life-changing windfall that would have secured the future of every employee who relied on us. But David had told me the client backed out at the last second, citing cold feet and market volatility. "We didn't back out," Hannah, Howard sighed, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and lingering frustration. I froze, the blood draining from my face as the realization settled in like lead. "Then what happened?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Howard slid a heavy folder across the polished mahogany table. It contained printed email threads, the digital evidence of a slow-motion catastrophe. During the final negotiations, David had tried to jack up the price by 30%. A blatant, greedy attempt to pocket a massive kickback, tucked away in the shadows, far outside the professional boundaries of our master agreement. When we refused to play along, he got arrogant, insulted my procurement VP with a vitriol that was entirely unprovoked, and blew the deal to smithereens. I stared at the emails, the cold, clinical language of the correspondence burning into my retinas. It made me sick, a visceral physical revulsion. It wasn't because of the lost money, as painful as that was to quantify. It was because, in that searing moment of clarity, I realized David had died years ago. The hard-working, humble man who stayed up all night to perfect our first CNC prototype, the man who smelled of machine oil and persistence, was truly gone. He had been replaced by a greedy, arrogant fraud. A man who had become so intoxicated by his own reflection that he thought he was untouchable. Honestly, another executive chimed in, leaning forward with a grimace, "We all wanted to keep doing business with you, Hannah. You were the backbone, the vision, the integrity. But dealing with David's ego became a liability we simply couldn't afford." Story after story came out, a parade of broken bridges. Lost bids that should have been ours, partners insulted by his posturing, shady backdoor demands for personal gain, and gross, systematic mismanagement. I had been completely shielded from this rot because I had stepped back, retreating into the shadows to let him shine, hoping to nourish his confidence. By the end of the meeting, the fog of confusion that had plagued me for months finally dissipated. I understood why the company collapsed so fast. It wasn't because I repossessed the machines, nor was it the fallout of the divorce. The foundation had rotted from the inside out years ago. I just happened to be the one who ripped down the drywall, exposing the hidden termites that had been devouring our life's work. That afternoon, back at my new office, the air felt sterilized and quiet. Ben walked in, his brow furrowed, looking more serious than I had ever seen him. "Hannah, bad news," he said, his posture rigid. I sipped my coffee, the warmth offering little comfort against the chill of his tone. "What is it?" "The bank just issued a formal notice of default on David's primary commercial loan. It's moving to collections," Ben said, his eyes searching mine. I stayed silent, processing the domino effect. "The issue," Ben continued, "is that you were the original guarantor on that note." The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the clock. I smiled softly, a ghost of my former self. But I severed my liability and restructured the guarantees 3 months ago. Remember?" Ben let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He smiled, a genuine flicker of relief. "Thank God you did. If I hadn't seen the warning signs months ago and legally firewalled my assets, David's sinking ship would have dragged me to the bottom of the ocean, drowning me in the debris of his failures." Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the McMansion was apocalyptic. My mother-in-law had suffered a complete mental breakdown after being caught in the web of her own deception. She cried, she begged, she clawed at the air, trying to justify her embezzlement, but the more she talked, the more the tapestry of her lies unraveled. It turned out that over the last 2 years, Vicky had been using the skimmed cash to buy my mother-in-law's loyalty. Designer bags, luxury cruises, high-end jewelry, all bribes, simple and transactional, to keep the old woman on her side and turn her against me. David sat listening to it all, his face ashen, stripped of his usual mask of bravado. He finally realized that if his mother hadn't actively encouraged his affair, if she hadn't constantly pressured our marriage with her poisonous influence, things might have been different. But it was too late for reflection. That night, David received a certified letter from the county court, and several major creditors had filed joint civil lawsuits. The damages demanded were astronomical, a mountain of debt that would cast a shadow over him for decades. Staring at the stack of legal threats, David felt true visceral terror. Not the hot, reactive anger of a wounded ego, but the cold, paralyzing dread of a man staring into the abyss of absolute ruin. As a thunderstorm raged outside, the lightning illuminating the office in jagged stabs of white, he sat in the dark. He pulled open a bottom drawer and found an old, battered leather notebook, my old operations ledger from our first year in business. He flipped through the yellowed pages, his trembling fingers tracing the history. Ordered raw aluminum, paid hourly wages, met with Howard, secured bridge loan from Dad, sold my Honda to cover Friday's payroll. David read the entries for hours, the ink a testament to a life he had discarded. Eventually, he let out a broken, agonizing laugh that shattered the silence. For years, he had convinced himself he was the genius who built the empire, the architect of our success. But reading my handwriting, he saw my ghost. A reminder that the brilliance he claimed as his own was merely the shadow of a woman he had systematically destroyed. He looked down at the page, seeing the meticulous detail of every sacrifice I had made. And suddenly he realized that his entire reality was built on the foundation of a woman he had never truly deserved, and the legacy he had claimed was now nothing more than an empty, haunting echo, leaving him to face the realization that the empire wasn't his, it was hers, and now that she had walked away, the entire structure was finally beginning to, in every single brick of the company, a silent monument to a partnership he had systematically dismantled. His success, once heralded as a masterpiece of personal vision, now revealed itself as nothing more than a hollow mirage, a fever dream constructed entirely on the foundation of my blood, my tireless sweat, and the salt of my tears. He had been a parasite feeding on the very lifeblood he pretended to cherish. The silence of the office was shattered by the shrill, intrusive buzz of his phone, vibrating against the mahogany desk like an insect trapped in a jar. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He swiped to answer, his voice cold and guarded. The voice on the other end was clipped, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. They spoke for less than a minute, but the words acted like a physical blow, leaving David paralyzed, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk. A private equity firm, a titan of industry known for scavenging the bones of failed enterprises, was making a move. They offered to buy the bankrupt, rotting remains of his company for pennies on the dollar. And the managing partner orchestrating the deal was my father, a man who had watched from the periphery as David systematically destroyed his daughter's legacy. David held the phone to his ear long after the connection had severed, the dial tone a mocking mechanical drone. Outside, the heavens opened, and the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, blurring the city lights into streaks of melancholy gray, as if the storm itself sought to wash away the last vestige of his crumbling pride. My father was coming for the kill. A year ago, David would have scoffed at the very notion, his laughter echoing with the arrogance of a man who believed himself invincible. But today, with the plant doors locked and silent, the crushing weight of debt tightening like a noose, and the cold reality of bankruptcy staring him in the face, he was a pauper in a king's suit. He had no leverage, no arguments, and no future. Yet, the final jagged remnant of his ego revolted at the thought of groveling to his ex-father-in-law to save his hollowed-out empire. David did not sleep. He paced the floor of his office, the night passing in a blur of remorse and cold sweat. By dawn, the desperation had eclipsed the pride. He called me. When I picked up, my voice was steady, distant. Hannah. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper, stripped of the bravado that once characterized our marriage. I need to see you, he pleaded. I'm busy, I replied, my gaze fixed on the sterile glass of the Dallas skyline. Please, just 10 minutes, he begged. I looked out at the city, a sprawling grid of ambition, and felt a chilling clarity. People only truly realize your value when they have reached the point of total annihilation. But by then, their regret is rarely about the love they discarded. It is merely a mourning for the utility they can no longer exploit. I agreed to meet. That afternoon we sat in a quiet, secluded corner of a coffee shop tucked away near the Arts District. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the heavy weight of things left unsaid. David was already there, hunched over a cold espresso. In the mere weeks since our lives had diverged, he had aged a decade. The perfectly tailored suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled button-down shirt that hung off his gaunt frame. He hadn't bothered to shave, and the dark, bruised circles beneath his eyes spoke of nights spent in the company of his own ghosts. The arrogant, untouchable playboy was dead, replaced by this hollow shell. I sat across from him, my posture upright, my hands folded calmly. David stared at me, his eyes searching my face as if he were trying to find the woman he once thought he could control, manipulate, and ultimately discard. But that woman had ceased to exist the very night. He slid the divorce papers across the table like a death sentence. "What do you want, David?" I asked, my voice slicing through the ambient noise of the shop. He took a jagged, shaky breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort. "Your dad," he whispered. "Your dad wants to buy the company." "I know," I said. "I know." A tremor passed through him. "You know?" He stared down at his trembling hands, his fingers twisting and wringing against each other until the skin flushed red. "Hannah, you won. You beat me." I remained perfectly stone-cold silent. I had never viewed our marriage or its dissolution as a game of chess. The true winner in a divorce is not the one who walks away with the most assets. The winner is the one who emerges with their dignity, their spirit, and their truth intact. David let out a bitter, self-deprecating chuckle that sounded like grinding glass. "I thought you were going to cry," he muttered, his eyes darting to mine. "I thought you would beg me to stay. I thought you were incapable of surviving without me." I looked him dead in the eye, unflinching, watching as the realization finally dawned on him. His eyes were red, glassy, and swimming with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Now I know," I said, my voice low and final. "I was the one who could not survive without you." The words hung in the stale air, suffocating and sharp. I turned my head to look out the window at the bustling, indifferent street. My mind traveled back, unbidden, to our tiny first apartment, the nights we spent huddled over a whiteboard, calculating costs until the sun rose. The nights we split a single $5 sandwich because we had nothing else to give. It was a beautiful, tender memory, but it belonged to a man who no longer existed, a man buried under years of betrayal. "I'm not asking you to take me back," David whispered, his head sinking low. "I know I don't have the right." I didn't flinch, my gaze remaining fixed on the horizon. "But I have to ask," he choked out, his voice barely audible over the hum of the coffee machine. "If I hadn't met Vicky? If I hadn't asked for the divorce? Would we have made it?" I studied him for a long, agonizing moment, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. Then slowly, deliberately, I shook my head. "No." David stiffened, his breath hitching. "Why?" he asked. "Because Vicky wasn't the cause, David," I explained, my tone surgical. "She was merely the symptom. You changed years ago. You changed the moment you began to treat the people who built you with utter contempt. The moment you convinced yourself that the success was yours alone. The moment you stopped knowing the meaning of gratitude. The marriage was long dead, David, long before you ever walked out the door." David lowered his head even further, burying his face in his hands. He knew I was right. There was no defense left, no lie he could weave to obscure the truth. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes, yet it felt like a lifetime of excavation. As I rose to leave, the chair scraping sharply against the floor, David called out to me, his voice cracking. "Hannah." I stopped, my back turned to him. He stood up, looking utterly, irrevocably defeated. "I'm sorry." It was the first apology he had ever offered, the first time he had ever surrendered his armor since the day we met. I didn't reply. I didn't offer him the comfort of forgiveness. I simply gave a curt, polite nod and walked out the door, leaving him alone in the dim light of the shop. An apology uttered only after one has lost everything is not an act of redemption. It is merely a desperate attempt to soothe a guilty conscience. 2 days later, the buyout negotiations were finalized. My father sat across from David in a sterile conference room. The atmosphere was thick, saturated with the suffocating scent of ozone and stale office coffee. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, a tombstone cast over the wreckage of an empire that once thrived on ambition. David sat slumped, his frame diminished as if the very gravity of his failures was pressing him into the synthetic leather of his chair. He looked utterly hollowed out, a man whose spirit had been excised in the operating theater of reality. He didn't offer a rebuttal, didn't attempt to salvage his dignity with empty rhetoric, and didn't bother to bargain for a single share. His eyes, once bright with the intoxicating fervor of corporate conquest, were now dull, fixated on the buyout figures. That sum, a mere pittance compared to the company's former glory, was barely enough to settle his mounting personal liabilities and pull him back from the precipice of a prison sentence for fraud. With a trembling hand that betrayed his utter resignation, he signed the papers, each stroke of the pen echoing like a gavel sentencing his past life to oblivion. As the pen lifted, the company bled away from him, returning to the sanctuary of my family. My father, his expression a fortress of weary disappointment, leveled his gaze at him. "David." "Yes, sir." "I didn't buy this company to humiliate you," my father spoke, his voice steady but laced with a profound, lingering sadness. "I bought it because I refused to let hundreds of good blue-collar workers, families who depend on their daily wages to survive, lose their livelihoods because of your reckless stupidity." David's shoulders shuddered. The dam broke and tears finally spilled over his eyelashes, carving clean, raw tracks through the mask of indifference he had desperately tried to maintain. In that moment of absolute ruin, the revelation hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He finally understood why my father had extended his hand 5 years ago. It was never a transaction, never about the cold arithmetic of money. It was about the audacity to believe in a hungry, ambitious kid with a dream, a mentorship he had repaid by spitting in my father's face. The restructuring of the factory was a slow, deliberate healing process. I stepped into the role of CEO alongside my father, treating the company like a wounded organism that needed nurturing to recover. We rehired the staff, reconnected the machines, and within months, the hum of industry returned as our old clients began to drift back, drawn by the return of integrity. As for David, the facade of his life completely unraveled. The McMansion, once the temple of his ego, was liquidated to appease the wolves of litigation. His luxury cars were towed away, leaving his driveway as empty as his future. His mother, disgraced and paralyzed by the looming specter of prosecution, retreated into the shadows of a shut-in's life. A few weeks later, a ping on my phone brought a text from an old acquaintance. "Did you hear? Vicky just got indicted for wire fraud and embezzlement." I stared at the screen, my expression unmoving. I felt no surge of triumph, no petty desire to gloat. Karma, I reflected, always collects its debts with precise interest. Yet, I was unprepared for the day, a few days later, when my former mother-in-law arrived at my office building. My secretary's voice was hesitant as she buzzed me, describing an older woman who looked desperate to see me. When the door swung open, the woman who entered was a ghost of her former self. Weight had abandoned her frame, leaving her clothes hanging loosely, and her hair had bleached into a ghostly white. She looked fragile, as if a sudden gust of wind might shatter her. She walked into the center of my office, standing with a jarring, uncomfortable hesitation before my desk. "Hannah, have a seat," I offered, my voice calm as I poured her a glass of water. Her hand shook violently as she reached for the crystal, the water rippling as she struggled to hold it. Suddenly she dissolved, the dam of her arrogance finally breached by the floods of her reality. "Hannah, I am so sorry," she sobbed, the sound raw and jagged. "I was so wrong." I watched her tears fall, feeling a strange detachment. There was no surge of anger, but equally, there was not a trace of the empathy I once felt for her. "For 5 years you did everything for us," she wept, her voice trembling with the weight of her sins. "And I treated you like a servant. I thought we were invincible. Now everything is gone. David is a shell of himself. He works a night shift at a logistics warehouse now, hauling crates in the dark, trying to pay for his survival. He won't even speak to me." I looked past her, out the window at the industrial park, where the smoke rose steadily from the chimneys. "Actions have consequences," I said softly. "He regrets it, Hannah. He truly does. He still loves you." I shook my head. A gentle but firm finality in the movement. Regret, I realized, is a useless currency. It cannot rebuild a bridge that has been incinerated to the waterline. I don't hate him, but the love that once formed the foundation of my life had evaporated, leaving no ghost behind. She reached into her bag and placed a small worn velvet box on my desk. I knew its contents before it opened. My wedding ring and David's band, cold symbols of a commitment that had been betrayed. I wanted to give these back to you, she choked out. I pushed the box back across the smooth surface of the desk. Keep them or sell them, I said firmly. They belong to a past I no longer have the capacity to carry. She broke down entirely, the finality of my gesture revealing to her that the door was not just closed. It was locked, and the key had been tossed into the sea. A few months later, I stood on the stage at our company's annual banquet, the golden light of the ballroom reflecting the strength of the community we had rebuilt. Hundreds of employees were cheering, their faces lit with genuine hope. My father sat in the front row, his gaze fixed on me, beaming with a pride that transcended business. Looking out at the sea of faces, a profound truth settled into my bones. Sometimes the most agonizing losses in life are merely the universe clearing out the trash to make room for your real destiny. My marriage had failed, but my life had not. It had simply been unburdened. A woman's worth is not defined by her ability to bind a man to her side. It is defined by her iron-willed ability to rebuild her empire from the ashes of his betrayal. Kindness is a virtue and sacrifice is noble. But kindness must be anchored by boundaries, and sacrifice must always demand the respect of the one who receives it. Never lose the core of who you are trying to hold on to someone who is perfectly content with destroying you. After the most violent storm, the sky always clears, revealing a horizon you never could have seen from within the chaos. As long as you have the courage to keep walking forward, peace is always waiting on the other